Just recently I was talking to John Lubecki, who's retired from the Army, was one of the early participants in the MAPS clinical trials and had his PTSD cleared up thanks to MDMA-assisted therapy and has become an advocate for psychedelic medicine as a result. But Lubecki said, after FDA announced that they were not going to approve MDMA-assisted therapy in August, he fielded, maybe a dozen calls from people, many of them veterans, saying, I was holding out hope for this medication, and now I'm just trying to determine whether it's worth sticking around longer. So it would have made a really big difference for a number of individual lives. It's impossible to, quantify that and speculate, but I really think, some people would have had longer lives and, just had better lives, been able to live to their fuller potential.
Welcome to Modern Enlightenment, a sanctuary for your soul, where we'll go on a path of personal and spiritual development. I'm Austin Mao.
And I'm Chuchu Wang. We are your companions on this journey of self-discovery and spiritual connection.
Join us as we delve into the fusion of modern psychotherapy, neuroscience, psychospirituality, and shamanic plant sacrament ceremonies, exploring the transformative potential of psychedelics for the mind, body, and spirit.
Our mission is to guide you to a place of profound awareness where emotions can be felt.
Together, let's illuminate the way to a brighter, more enlightened existence.
Modern Enlightenment, where your journey to inner peace begins.
I'm very excited to introduce Rachel Nuwer, who's a freelance science journalist and the author of a book that's been really impactful for me called I Feel Love. What's the subtitle again?
It's I Feel Love, MDMA and the Quest for Connection in a Fractured World.
Yes, there you go, MDMA. And what really intrigued me about this book, Rachel, is I guess now learning that you're a journalist, like the in-depth journalism on the history of MDMA and how it became both recreationally mainstream and then used, therapeutically. So welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's great to finally connect. We've been trying to get together for months now, I guess, and just coinciding busy schedules.
Right. I remember us meeting at Psychedelic Science and you were doing the book signing. And I was just really excited to make this acquaintance because to have an entire book focused on one particular molecule, there's not a lot out there. And the ones that are out there are usually on ayahuasca or psilocybin mushrooms. To have one so focused on MDMA, which is, theoretically going to be the first to be legalized by the FDA, right? We were hoping for that on August 11th.
Possibly, yeah. We'll see.
We'll see, exactly.
I'm not so sure anymore, but we'll see.
And I'm curious, what led you down the path of getting interested in writing about MDMA and MDMA-assisted therapy?
Yeah, so I'm a science journalist, so I do journalism about science. And one of the great things about my job as a freelancer is I get to follow my passions oftentimes. And for the first decade or so of my career, my primary passion was conservation, ecology, and wildlife. So I spent a lot of time, especially looking into the illegal wildlife trade. So I think poaching for ivory of elephants and rhino horn, and wrote a book about that called Poached: Inside the Dark World of Wildlife Trafficking. And that was great. It was a passion, but I felt as time passed that I was kind of just getting sort of cast as the journalist who writes about wildlife trade. And that was getting kind of repetitive. I felt sort of like I was writing the same story over and over again. And it's also a pretty depressing topic. So when the pandemic hit, I was here in Brooklyn and, that we had this very strict lockdown, and it gave me time to really think about my career and trajectory and what I really wanted out of the next chapters of life. I was thinking about these questions one early evening while I was on MDMA. And, it's just like, okay, we're in a pandemic. What can we do to bring a little bit of joy? So my husband, a friend, and I from our pod did MDMA. So, I took a break from the dancing, sat down on the couch, was thinking about these questions, and in popped my mind, oh, MDMA, maybe I can pivot and do a book about MDMA because I really like writing books. The next morning, sobered up, obviously, I did some research and realized that indeed there wasn't a book all about MDMA. And, like you said, I just thought this molecule is worthy of its own story. It's got its own unique history, its culture, the crazy politics surrounding the science. It really seemed to me to deserve a book-length treatment. I had a lot of questions about it myself. I'd never really reported on it before. It kind of became my pandemic project. I just dove into putting a proposal together, finally found a buyer for it. And yeah, now I find myself on the other side of this project with MDMA and psychedelic science added to my beat.
Wow. So while you were on MDMA, you thought about writing a book on MDMA. I mean, of course, go figure.
It's actually funny, like throughout my reporting, the number of times that has kind of happened to people, whether it's like things that I reported on in the book, like Paul Oakenfeld and his friends going down to Ibiza, getting on MDMA for the first time, and then thinking to themselves, oh, we should bring this back to London, and saying in interviews later, this drug, it like gives you the confidence and the creativity to think of these ideas and then to actually execute on them. To just private conversations I've had with friends, like a friend of mine said she realized while she was on MDMA that she needed to divorce her husband. And, a few months later she did, and it wound up being a really great decision for her. So I think there is something interesting about the molecule that can give people sort of a clarity of mind that, maybe all of our thought patterns get in the way of in our sober life.
It's so fascinating to me that what you just said gives you the clarity of mind, right? Because MDMA is often described as a heart opener, as an empathogen.
Yep.
Right? And there's this almost like dualistic nature between the mind and the heart that's implicit in your statement that I also agree with. And that when the heart feels closed, the mind can be confused or stagnant or immovable, not malleable, right? So I'm curious, like, you've probably heard dozens of stories in the journalistic pursuit of writing this book. Like, what are some standout ones that you can remember?
First of all, you put that so beautifully. Now I wish I had interviewed you for the book. That was
sequel.
Really nice way. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, Feeling Love Part 2. I mean, honestly, the stories I encountered in the reporting were just so moving and, in so many different ways. There were the people I spoke to who have gone through MDMA-assisted therapy, whether in the clinical trials or the underground, who had really moving of recovery, of healing, of hope. But on the flip side of that, there were also really terribly moving stories. Like I interviewed a mother, for example, whose teenage daughter died of an accidental overdose of MDMA, which, speaks to the problems of prohibition. So, I mean, yeah, I could tell stories for days about what's in that book. But is there anything in particular you're interested in?
There's lots of different applications for MDMA, right? It's often known as ecstasy on the street and used for partying and dancing, as you were dancing when you came up with this idea. It's used in general, like MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, which is what is going through the FDA. MDMA paired with psychotherapeutic practices, right? A trained professional, usually when it's above ground, usually it's under the MAPS protocol, right? MAPS being the nonprofit organization that is pushing many of these psychedelic medicines through regulatory channels. But the third one that, and I've done both of those, but the third one that's been the most impactful for me has been in couples work, right? And I saw this meme the other day. It's like, at our company, we don't have HR, we just have MDMA.
Oh my God. Nice. If only it was that easy. Yeah.
But to an extent, like, it's this medicine creates a opening that two people, that my partner and I, have been able to communicate through in ways that we were completely closed before.
It's incredible.
So I'm curious, like, I'm sure you've heard several accounts. You mentioned one where a couple decided to get divorced. I wonder if you could tell me about that. Because normally you don't think of like a successful relationship conversation as ending in divorce, but.
Absolutely. She wasn't with her partner. She was just doing a one-on-one session with a therapist. But yeah, she just realized, this is a friend of mine, that she needed to get a divorce. And, she'd been having issues for a while and kind of stewing on it. But suddenly she just had this light going on. Oh, like this is the path for me. And, she didn't do it the next day. She took time to think about the decision, but ultimately it was the right one for her. I have heard, however, of a couple negotiating their divorce terms on MDMA, which I don't know, it seems like that could be an interesting idea for more people to go through, having seen like how ugly it got with my parents, for example. Maybe if they had been ended in a more amicable way. Couples therapy isn't something I got into a lot in the book, but honestly, I wish I had delved into it a little bit more. I touched on it in the beginning insofar as before Prohibition in 1985, a lot of the therapy and the very limited amount of research occurred with couples, and there were really promising results, anecdotally mostly, back in those days. And obviously the results have continued to be anecdotal since then. There is one, I don't know if it's a clinical trial, maybe it's a small clinical trial going on in Canada that does couples therapy with MDMA, but it's through the lens of one of the people in the partnership has PTSD. So it's not just like kind of healthy normals. So I think that is a field that's really ripe for exploration, and hopefully we can get there after we finally, possibly, maybe get FDA approval of MDMA for PTSD, or MDMA-assisted therapy, I should say. It's kind of baby steps here. But yeah, hopefully that'll open the door for a lot more research into other indications.
I know you interviewed Rick Doblin on, for your book. He's the founder and director of MAPS. And, Rick has been on our show recently and a dear friend. I get to meet him quite often. I love the man. I love hearing his story about why he chose MDMA. At that time, he had, I think, just gotten his PhD in public policy and decided that what he wanted to do to legalize some form of psychedelic-assisted therapy is he chose MDMA because it was like the lowest hanging fruit, right? Everything else was just banned. And, he could not have imagined that it would have taken 38 years to get to an FDA decision. Unfortunately, that decision was adverse. But, being with him in that process, or being with him hearing his story about how the selection for MDMA was not necessarily from the place of like, this is the very best possible medicine, right? It was from a place of, well, everything else is Schedule 1 now. We can't even study LSD or psilocybin. Like, what's left? This is the next best option, right? And, I'm curious if you've heard accounts, or maybe you thought of like the what if scenario, right? Like, what if 1985 MDMA wasn't banned, right? And it was made freely available for psychotherapy. Like, what if MAPS and Rick was successful at getting the full FDA approval of this? Like, where would our society be now with this extraordinarily powerful molecule?
Yeah, for sure. Oh, just one thing. Rick got his PhD actually along this long journey to try to seek approval of MDMA. When he'd gotten it before. It's actually even more impressive because he was like so dedicated on this journey of trying to bring this molecule back into the light of scientific and medical respectability that he was just doing everything he could, including getting a doctorate from Harvard that would help him navigate the policy environment of the FDA. So yeah, Rick discovered MDMA in the early 80s before it was put on Schedule 1. And one of the reasons that he was so attracted to it, in addition to it not being illegal, was the fact that it did this heart opening that we were talking about. And, Rick is Jewish. He grew up in a family where, sometimes they'd have dinner table discussions about the Holocaust. And he was convinced that people could just like lose their mind at any moment and just go on like murderous sprees, like because of these stories. So through his whole early adulthood, he was searching for some kind of answer. Okay, how do we prevent the next Holocaust? How do we like prevent this darkest force of humanity to surface again? And in MDMA, he thought he found a solution in terms of facilitating communication, openness, empathy for yourself, for each other. Okay, so MDMA obviously got banned, as you mentioned, in 85. It was also added to Schedule 1. I mean, I could speculate all day about what could have been, what would have been. I truly think that there would be people alive today who aren't because they've taken their own lives, out of despair. I mean, when Rick was in the early stages of trying to get these clinical trials off the ground, he received a letter from a guy, I can't remember the man's name, to my book. It starts with a Z, but this guy was in Florida and he had tried all the different therapies. He had PTSD and a bunch of other comorbidities. And he was basically begging Rick for a reference to an underground therapist who could do MDMA-assisted therapy with him. And Rick declined because the guy had, I think it was epilepsy. And he was concerned, if MDMA triggers an epileptic seizure, then, this guy could, wind up getting hurt, wind up dying, and it's going to implicate both him in a very illegal activity that could cause the therapist to lose their license, even go to jail. So Rick said, it's just too dangerous. And the guy wound up committing suicide the next day. And Rick only found out about this because a couple months after he had that phone call, a policeman in Florida called him and said, hey, we found this letter addressed to you at this man's home. Can I send it to you? And Rick showed me the letter. It was really moving. It was basically like, I understand that your hands are tied, that, it's not your fault that you can't help me. It's the DEA's fault and the government's fault, but I just can't keep going. Like, I'm done. This is the last thing I was holding out hope for. And, he even said in the letter, I give you permission to use this letter in whatever way will help, like, just forward this fight to bring this medication into legality so people like me can use it. And, that story has been repeated so many times over the past 39, almost 40 years. Just recently I was talking to John Lubecki, who's retired from the Army, was one of the early participants in the MAPS clinical trials and had his PTSD cleared up thanks to MDMA-assisted therapy, and has become an advocate for psychedelic medicine as a result. But Lubecki said, after FDA announced that they were not going to approve MDMA-assisted therapy in August, he fielded, maybe a dozen calls from people, many of them veterans, saying, I was holding out hope for this medication, and now I'm just trying to determine whether it's worth sticking around longer. So, yeah, I think it would have made a really big difference for a number of individual lives. It's impossible to, quantify that and speculate, but I really think, some people would have had longer lives and, just had, better lives, been able to live to their fuller potential as a result. But now we're going to wait probably a few more years. Hopefully it'll be available sooner than later. But for all those people who are suffering and could potentially benefit, it's really a shame.
I just had tingles because, I remember when Rick recorded his first interview after the FDA ruling on our podcast. And what he said was, I asked him, like, how do you feel? Like, you must feel really down, right? And he said that, he feels really sad for the people that could have been helped by this medicine. And what really strikes me is, we read the science, we read the legalities, the tests, the studies, so on and so forth, and they're numbers. But underneath the numbers is our souls, our people who are deeply suffering.
Human beings, yeah.
Like the people that went through those trials, they were selected because they had PTSD, right? Military grade PTSD or treatment-resistant depression. These are people that were deeply suffering. And hearing your account now is like, yeah, people have been holding out for this because it's been almost the last hope. Mm-hmm. We see this often here because at Ceremonia, we're one of the leading providers of plant medicine ceremonies in the United States. And often people come to us and they're like, this is my last hope. I don't know, what else I can do. And I read about this having dramatic transformative effects and like, I'm putting it on the line for this.
Yeah. And I mean, it's not going to work for everybody for sure. I mean, the trials show that it's, most people were benefited, but not all. There is no medication that works for every person. We're all different biologically, but I do really think that the data are there to support that it is efficacious and that the benefits do outweigh the risks, despite what, the FDA advisory committee determined.
Yeah, it's, both fortunately and unfortunately, we have this process, right? Mm-hmm. The unfortunate part is that maybe this process is also politicized too. I mean, there's a lot of big pharma money that would evaporate if people successfully treated their mental illnesses. And MDMA is orders of magnitude more effective than the most effective psychiatric drug compared with therapy, in comparison. And so it kind of makes sense that this thing is so hard to get, pushed through.
Yeah, totally. I have been in touch with someone who worked for a long time with Lykos, also known as MAPS PBC, now the pharmaceutical company, putting together that application. And I don't know, speaking with him, it sounds more like, because this is the first psychedelic treatment to seek approval, just the barriers to entry are way higher than it would be if something else had already come, if this wasn't a stigmatized drug with a long history of abuse. So, everything just has to be like absolutely spick and span perfect. And, talking to him, it didn't seem like anything like conspiratorials going on with other pharma involvement, but more just like the FDA really needs extremely solid data. And there were too many allegations, unfounded allegations, as far as I can tell, by the way, flying around in the media, in the AdCom meetings, repeated in the ICER report that came out shortly before the AdCom, as well as just data that left questions because Lykos didn't do things like measure quote unquote positive adverse events, which is MDMA's ability to cause euphoria, which the DEA considers an adverse event because it signals supposed abuse potential. So, there were some missing pieces of data here and there, some questions around the durability of the results. And perhaps if, again, MDMA wasn't this stigmatized drug, and also this wasn't a first-in-class treatment that combines not, a pharmaceutical with therapy, which is like truly revolutionary for the FDA and for psychiatric medicine as a whole, maybe MDMA would have been approved. But there were just it was described to me as death by a thousand cuts. There were just too many little things that were missing or questionable. And then, this big hurdle of the drug paired with therapy that they decided to take the cautious route, being bureaucrats. They're not there to take risks. They're there to, protect their necks and ask for more data. But yeah, I mean, like we were just saying, that unfortunately delays things for everybody else. Hopefully we'll come out on the other side of it with even more solid data that can help future practitioners determine who truly will benefit from it, how to go about making sure they get the most benefit, how to reduce potential harms and risks. But yeah, I mean, I've talked to so many people who have deep expertise in this, who think like we could have just collected these data after the fact, as out in the real world. But that's not how it played out.
Yeah, totally. Like, I also spoke to someone who recently retired from the FDA. He was involved in the decision-making process to designate MDMA as a breakthrough therapy drug.
Well, I think we probably talked to the same guy.
Probably. I'm not going to name names, but
okay.
Probably.
Okay.
Yeah.
I didn't know if you interviewed him on the show. Okay.
Yeah.
That sounds familiar.
I haven't yet, but
I recommend you do. It's very enlightening chatting with him.
Yes. If we're talking about the same person, he may also join us for a retreat, which I would be excited about. Yeah. But anyways, what I found interesting was that all this talk about, this is really the first time that the FDA was like reviewing something that was paired with therapy, right? A drug that was paired with therapy, which was its whole own ball game,
Yeah, I mean, therapy is actually outside the purview of the FDA, so they don't even know like what to do with that. Yeah. And this source that perhaps we both had talked to was telling me, the FDA even suggested to Lykos, like, why don't you just make it like the drug and therapy instead of the therapy and the drug? But Lykos wasn't budging on that, which I kind of salute them for, because it really is the drug catalyzing the therapy. It's not the other way around, and I can get into the neuroscience behind that as far as we know. But, instead of kind of compromising and saying, okay, sure, we'll say that the therapy is just there to reduce risk, or the therapy is just like a little assist, they really stuck to their guns and said, no, we're emphasizing the therapy. And unfortunately, that was part of their undoing with the application, as far as I understand it.
Totally. It's like, Rick said that he believes to offer this medicine without therapy is unethical. And I believe that to be the case too. Like,
absolutely. Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's absolutely no evidence that it would do anything besides potentially grant somebody a good time if they do it in a dance area or rave. But yeah, to just give it to someone who's in deep pain and sit them on the couch, that wouldn't do anything, and it would potentially cause harm as well.
And I'd like to speak to this for a bit because, the reason why I believe it's unethical is because our mind traps and secures that content, the memories, the beliefs, the feelings, for a reason, right? For combat veterans that I've worked with, when they're, reliving a trauma, the detail of that reliving of it is so extraordinary that they had completely forgotten, right? Their mind really suppressed like the actual sensation in their body of what that was. And it's doing that for a reason, because without the proper support, these people could be completely handicapped in their social interactions and even physically. Like, one of the combat veterans that had come to Ceremonia, after a hug, he could be so debilitated that he wouldn't be able to walk to the bathroom.
Oh, wow.
And he engaged first in MDMA-assisted therapy, created a massive opening for him, and then went through our 3 psilocybin journeys and concluded like fully eye-gazing, dancing, smiling, saying he wants to get on stage and share this with the world, So I think that's also something that isn't necessarily in the public domain of knowledge either, that we so focus on psilocybin or we so focus on MDMA, but these medicines, these drugs are not nearly as effective and may actually be harmful if they're not paired with, with proper professional support.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I heard a couple anecdotes in my reporting about people who just had this kind of serendipitous healing. They're at a rave and suddenly they realize like this or that and come out of it with, real healing. But that seems to be like very small minority. I mean, otherwise, everybody, the millions of people who go out and take MDMA every year at a festival, a rave, at home, whatever, would, be a lot more mentally healthy. But yeah, it just doesn't work like that. And have you interviewed Gulda Lin on your podcast yet, the neuroscientist?
I haven't interviewed her, but I know her.
Okay, great. I didn't want to repeat for listeners, but Gulda Lin's research, she was at Johns Hopkins, now she's at UC Berkeley, but she really provides what seems to be the best mechanistic explanation that we have, and that more and more evidence is building up that she's right. And that is that MDMA and other psychedelics as well, when put in the right set and setting, reopen what's called a critical period. And that's just a phrase neuroscientists have for these finite windows of malleability when the brain is primed to learn new things. They typically occur for us in childhood, and they occur also across the whole animal kingdom. Think of like geese imprinting on somebody as their mom. It's also why kids can learn a language with fluency and grow up without an accent, whereas, you try to learn a language as an adult, you can't because your critical period is closed. So what psychedelics do is they reopen these key critical periods, and you can tune the critical period depending on the set and setting. So in talk therapy, you're reopening this social critical period that allows you to re-engage with your trauma. But Gould's idea is that if you change that set and setting, so say you pair occupational therapy instead of talk therapy with someone who's had a stroke and who you've given MDMA to, could you reopen a critical period for motor reward learning rather than social learning and repair their ability to move or to, regain their full movement? So, if Gould's right, which again, it's more evidence is building pointing that she is, and just the way that these things work, it seems like she might be. That really explains why you can't just go to a rave and take MDMA and come out with healing. You really need that guidance, that therapist to help you navigate what you're going through, and also that mindset to actually engage with your trauma, to, ask it questions, to try to come out with some sort of solution. So yeah, I agree with Rick. If you just gave somebody MDMA and sat them on a couch, like, you're probably not going to get much out of it. And yeah, you could definitely do harm for somebody who's not prepared for that.
Yeah, I remember watching Gould present at the Aspen Psychedelics Symposium and talking about critical periods. And then I was recently with Robin Carhart-Harris, who's also coming on our podcast, where he was referencing those periods.
Yeah, definitely.
And I'm curious, like, as we're talking about pairing therapy with the empathogen, have you come across different accounts of like the effectiveness of different kinds of therapy, different therapists, like in different modalities,
Yeah, great question. Most, if not all, of what I've heard about really follows that MAPS protocol, which is kind of get out of the way, let people do their work, let things come up. Don't try to direct them. Don't try to be, oh, well, you should think about this or that, or like, here, let's do this activity. And, it's sometimes referred to as the inner healing intelligence, which can sound a bit woo to scientists, but it's a metaphor for the fact that our bodies generally can heal themselves. So Michael Mithofer, who helped to write that protocol, psychiatrist and former ER doctor, he likens it to his ER days when, someone would come in with a bullet wound. He removes the bullet, he cleans the wound, stitches the person up, but he's not actually doing the healing. The body is doing the healing. He's just, laying the groundwork to give the body the best chance possible. And that's pretty much the equivalent of the therapeutic approach. The therapists are typically there to guide people to, if they have questions, to, help keep them on track, to, if they're getting upset by something, help them navigate through that. But they're not there to, direct people in the same way that conventional talk therapy oftentimes does.
Yeah, that's really an important part of our process too, right? Allowing the inner healing intelligence forward. But, you can read this in the MAPS manual, which is freely available on the internet, and receive training from MAPS or even other third-party institutions on how to hold psychedelic-assisted therapy. But as we're creating and developing our own practitioner training, and I've been paying attention to the nuance of what it means to take a step back and allow someone their own process, it's a lot more nuanced, a lot more tricky than one might think. I remember I was coming out of the bathroom in one ceremony, and right in front of me, there's one of the participants, And Eric looks at me and he says, should I go to the bathroom? If you've ever taken psilocybin, right, which is what the sacrament that we work with, like the distance between lying down, getting up, and taking the walk to the bathroom is like an eternity. Okay. So in my mind, I'm thinking,
it's an undertaking.
Right. Exactly. In my mind, I'm thinking, well, absolutely, you should go to the bathroom. You made all this effort. Like, clearly you want to go to the bathroom. And there's a part of me that really wanted to say that. But instead, what I said is, well, only you know. Right.
Oh, nice.
And
yeah.
And he looked up and he said, yeah, I do know. And then he went to the bathroom.
Yeah. It kind of summarizes it.
That was one of the most of him was. And in that moment, he discovered that he does know to trust his own inner guidance, his own inner intuition. Right.
Oh, wow.
And that's like one of the subtleties that, I train other practitioners to really tune in, because for me to have said, yes, you should go to the bathroom, who was I saying that for? Was I saying it for him, or was I saying it for me? Same when like someone's crying, right? When most people have a friend that cry, they probably, first inclination is like put a hand on their shoulder, right? Or give them a hug, or say, don't cry. It's okay. It's going to be okay. Right. But who's that for? Truly. Is it for my friend or is it for me? And if I'm really honest with myself, it's for me, because I feel uncomfortable with my friend crying. I don't want them to cry. Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's the really tricky thing about like tuning into the inner healing of intelligence. It requires a level of trust that their inner healer is going to navigate them out of this complex maze of stuckness. Right. But also trust in myself as a facilitator, that whatever arises, I can hold space for them or support them through it. And then trust in the universe or God or whatever you want to call it, that the way knows the way, that, there is no such thing as a bad experience or a bad trip, that it just, the only way out is through, rather than trying to force a consequence,
Yeah, that was really beautifully put.
Yeah. In this like journalistic pursuit of trying to understand MDMA, like how much of your efforts was targeted towards like speaking to patients or people that have gone through it versus like the scientists and advocates and whatnot?
Yeah, primarily it was definitely both. I certainly spoke to more scientists and some advocates as well. And, even like politicians and policymakers. I even talked to like some of the biggest MDMA producers from the 80s. Like I definitely talked to a lot of people who have gone through it. But I mean, yeah, as fascinating as those stories are, I tended to just need like a few to kind of drive the story forward and serve as an example for whatever point I was making, whether it's the combat veterans piece or just the sheer potential of these treatment to help people navigate through some of the toughest times, they've ever faced in their life. So yeah, I guess if I had to say, it was more scientists, but I'm a science journalist, so.
I just imagine, like one of my great joys is speaking to people on podcasts like this, right? And I just imagine in the process going from the ideation of dancing on MDMA to like the investigation, like what are the key things that you learned in that process? Maybe.
Oh my God, everything.
And I'm also really curious, what are the key things you learned about yourself through that process?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I'll say that like virtually everything in that book are things I learned. I knew basically nothing about psychedelic science before I started the reporting project. So everything in there is new to me. I mean, I even read a neuroscience textbook because I hadn't taken a neuroscience class at college. So like even the neuroscience is new to me. But don't worry, I did fact check the book, so it should be all accurate. I have not gotten any complaints so far, and a lot of scientists have read it. Yeah, I mean, that's one of the reasons I wanted to pursue this project, though, because I really was craving a new intellectual challenge. Like I said, I was kind of tired of writing what was like kind of the same tired story about humans destroying the planet, killing animals. So it really did help scratch that itch for me of wanting to just pivot and try something completely new and learn along the way. That's really the best part of my job, getting to learn and share it with readers. Oh, what did it teach me about myself? It's a great question. I guess it made me a lot more aware of the existence of trauma all around me, and the people I know and the people I don't know, the people I might encounter in the grocery store. I think it's on my best days, it's made me a more empathetic and patient person, both with other people and with myself. I don't always have best days. But yeah, and just as a writer as well, it gave me more confidence in my storytelling abilities. So my first book, I inserted myself a lot. But this book, I talked about myself briefly in the introduction, and then I stepped back and just let the characters and the people whose lives have been touched by MDMA in some way, shape, or form, whether for good, bad, everything in the middle, tell their stories.
Before we jumped on this podcast, I hope you don't mind me sharing that you said that you hadn't actually engaged in this sort of MDMA-assisted therapy, right? Yeah. Meanwhile, when I asked you how you came up with the idea, you told me that you were on MDMA dancing. And I'm curious, through the journalistic process, is there a specific reason why you haven't pursued trying this on?
Yeah, it's a great question. I feel like this is a typical issue journalists have, dive into other people's suffering and, very good at sharing the knowledge and the information with readers, but we tend oftentimes to neglect our own self-care. Ernesto, oh man, his last name is slipping my mind, New York Times reporter. He just wrote a really beautiful book about this, which is his sort of suffering and silence as a reporter, as a war reporter, and then his journey of psychedelic healing, which I was just very impressed with how brave he was to embark on that journey at the first place and then actually write about it in a book. Trippy is his book. So I'm probably just trying to avoid talking about myself here, but yeah, I haven't done it. I guess I sort of in my mind know that it would be very beneficial for me, and I just haven't really worked up the courage or the nerve to just do it. And I feel like I should probably do regular talk therapy first to just onboard myself, but I'm still looking for a good talk therapist who actually takes my insurance. So if anyone knows a good Blue Cross Blue Shield funded therapist, I'm shopping for a therapist. But yeah, it's something that I think eventually I will do. My husband has told me I should do it, but it just hasn't quite come up yet.
Oh man. Usually if my partner tells me I should do therapy, it's probably not a good sign.
Yeah, it's dark times these days with all that's going on in the world. And also with the field of journalism is really in a dire state right now. So I'm having a lot of career anxiety and existential dreads. But I don't know, maybe MDMA-assisted therapy would give me a new career path. We'll see.
I think that this discussion points at, I think a lot of people think that MDMA-assisted therapy or psychedelic-assisted therapy are for people that have significant mental ailments, right? PTSD, treatment-resistant depression, end-of-life anxiety, so on and so forth. And really, it's the benefits of this span across demographics, right?
Absolutely.
The scope and depth of the medicine when paired with therapy is extraordinary. For example, one of our youngest participants came with her mother and father here. And what was really interesting about her, she wanted to do this work. And when we dived into her history, both her parents, so it was her mother and stepfather, both the parents said that she didn't really have trauma with a capital T in her childhood. Meanwhile, in the circle, there were several people that had really significant trauma and previous suicidality and people with diagnosed PTSD or complex PTSD, etc. And it was fascinating to watch her process. Now, we're working with psilocybin, not MDMA, but it's definitely analogous. And it's interesting to watch somebody without real trauma go through the psychedelic-assisted process, right?
Yeah.
And what unfolds as part of our overall thesis at Ceremonia is that when we let go of our protective layers, we gain access to creativity and energy that's been long trapped, right? So over the course of 3 ceremonies, we typically see 100% of the people enter into a state of great optimism and creativity for the future. But she got there on day 1, on session 1,
wow. Yeah.
And so this is, I think for me, I'm fascinated by this. Right? Because having worked with hundreds of people, from top Fortune 500 executives and politicians to, combat veterans and first responders, the whole gamut of human experience is available for this. And so when you shared oh yeah, I want to try MDMA-assisted. I mean, I don't know your past, but you seem like a high functioning individual in front of me right now. And I think this, just speaks to what's available for people,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's always been Rick Doblin's long-term goal is, MDMA-assisted therapy available for well people, just anybody who wants to, like you said, unlock their creativity, probe questions inside them. Yeah, I think it could be very nice if we could get to a world at which that is available for people who are interested.
Well, I'm hopeful that your book is part of that process. I imagine that it is, to destigmatize MDMA, share how mainstream it's been and how effective it is. So just lots of gratitude to you for your curiosity and your journalism there.
Well, yeah, likewise. Thank you. Thank you so much.
So before we conclude, Rachel, I'm curious if there's anything that you want to share with our listeners. How can we find you?
Well, I guess, okay, the book is available all over the internet. I think it's on sale on Amazon right now. So, scoop up a copy if you haven't already. I've got an ebook as well and an audiobook. I am also on the internet, rachelnuwer@gmail.com. You can reach me anytime. As far as parting thoughts, I mean, I guess for those out there who were really holding out hope that MDMA-assisted therapy would gain approval in August, don't give up hope. People seem very confident that it is going to make it through the approval process. It's just going to take a little bit more time than we expected.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you for helping conclude on that message of hope. It was the same that Rick shared as well.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah, I mean, I think it's the truth. So, I wouldn't say it if I didn't believe in it.
Yeah. Well, thank you for coming on the show. Thank you for great work that you're doing. Please check out Rachel Nuwer's book, I Feel Love. Really great read and really well written. Bravo. So until next time.
Yeah, thank you again for having me. Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Modern Enlightenment. If you enjoyed today's conversation, be sure to check out our website, subscribe to our online community, and check out our social media links in the show notes for more resources and updates.
And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast to stay connected with our upcoming episodes, where we continue to explore the intersection of modern science and spiritual wisdom. Until next time, stay curious, stay inspired, and keep shining your light.